When the storm clouds first rolled in over the decimated ruins of the old cities, hardly anyone noticed. The world had gone quiet after the third pandemic, followed shortly by the ecological collapse that left most land barren. Survival had become the lone unifying principle. People relied on whispered rumors that certain high-tech facilities had never gone dark. These labs, hidden in the deep wilderness, were rumored to conduct experiments to save humanity from extinction. In those sealed corridors, new beings were grown. Not clones in the old sense of the word, not test tube babies in a single jar, but entire incubators arranged in rows, each containing a developing human child. The survivors outside continued to dwindle, huddled in broken houses and repurposed bunkers. Meanwhile, in the labs, there was a plan. Create enough healthy humans to replace the ones who had died. They would be perfect, or so the scientists assured themselves. In the early years, there was mutual hope. The lab children, as they came to be called, surprised their creators by maturing at a normal pace rather than hyper-accelerated growth. Their physiology and intellect were outstanding, but they exhibited emotions, curiosity, and social behaviors remarkably similar to those of natural-born humans. Scientists believed these children were no different, only that their existence granted humanity a second chance. They never intended for the lab children to remain cloistered in underground corridors forever, and so eventually the young were sent out to mingle among the natural-born survivors. It was meant to be a grand reintegration, to show that liberty and progress could rise together out of the planet's ashes. But as the lab children matured, a swift undercurrent of fear and resentment began to form among certain circles of survivors. Tales of abnormal intelligence, rumored telepathic abilities, and an uncanny uniformity spread like an infection. The lab children stood out wherever they went. Nobody remembered exactly when the number of lab children first surpassed that of natural-born survivors. There was no official census, just a creeping realization that neighborhood gatherings contained more artificially created individuals than anyone could ignore. Eventually, entire regions were populated primarily by these new humans. The labs had spread out, building satellite facilities to supply a desperate demand. Without them, the species would dwindle dangerously toward extinction. With them, humanity was multiplied, albeit in a radically altered form. At first, the lab child presence did more good than harm, lending strong backs and bright minds to rebuild the roads, cultivate new agricultural techniques, and so on. But subtle frictions mounted. Older families whispered about their suspiciously ever-healthy neighbors, while lab children, in turn, found themselves targeted and labeled as unnatural. Elia was among the last generation of natural-born humans. The year of her birth, official population counts put the ratio of lab children to naturally conceived at nearly 2-to-1. By the time she was 10, it was 4-to-1. After her parents died during one of the last major plagues, she was taken in by her uncle, Arik, a man who made no secret of his distrust for synthetics, as he derisively called them. He taught Elia to live off the land in ways the lab children, he claimed, would never understand. In his mind, reliance on biotech made them weak, incapable of souls. Elia herself was less sure. Growing up, she found that some of her best memories came from spontaneous acts of empathy by lab children. At the same time, she couldn't deny that their presence felt different. They moved in groups, often nodded in unison, and rarely engaged in raw emotional outbursts. Something about how they experienced life set them apart. One harsh winter soon after Elia turned 16, their bunker ran precariously low on supplies. The old orchard they relied upon had ceased to bear fruit following a bad drought. Arik insisted on bartering in the nearest settlement, which by then was almost entirely inhabited by lab children. He told Elia to stay behind, but hardship and curiosity compelled her to follow him. When they arrived, she found the settlement to be well-structured but eerily silent. Rows of neat prefab cabins stood in a grid, each lit with a single pale beam of solar-charged light. The inhabitants, mostly young adults of identical approximate age, turned their heads as if on cue when Arik approached. He tried to negotiate for seeds, but his gruff manner and thinly veiled scorn caused a tense standoff. Then a tall lab child in simple gray clothes stepped forward, introduced herself as Nova, and offered supplies in exchange for some small mechanical repairs Arik could perform. That night, over a simple meal, Elia listened as Nova explained they were building something called the Sanctuary, an environment designed for humans to flourish in once more. She sounded resolute in making a future where humanity as a whole could survive. Arik remained suspicious, certain the lab children wanted to lure them in, only to enslave or eradicate the natural born. Elia disagreed privately. Nova and the others seemed sincere, but there was a pervasive uniformity in how they spoke, carefully, calmly, as though sharing a single script. Later, as Elia wandered the quiet streets of the settlement, she stumbled upon a small memorial. Inside was a line of photographs depicting the earliest lab children. A thick annotation below each photograph explained the modifications made to correct vulnerabilities during gestation. At the end of the display was a short reflection. "We were born to restore the human story." Something about those words haunted her. She realized that all these lab-grown beings were burdened with a great directive, ensuring that they were humankind's grand solution. It gave them a purpose, but robbed them of a personal history. Over time, tensions reached a boiling point. The sanctuary concept spread globally, a network of lab-child communities that rarely welcomed older generations. Some long-time survivors demanded to know why so many resources were now being channeled into structures that excluded them. Rumors spoke of lab children forming a new government with specialized assemblies dictating production and energy allocation. While official statements insisted natural-born humans were welcome, the reality felt different. Checkpoints sprouted along the roads. Identification badges had to be presented. More alarming were the quietly disappearing border towns, swallowed up by the sanctuary's expansion. These developments incited fear, or worse, violent panic. At 17, Elia's restlessness drove her to set out on her own. She wanted to see the sanctuary from the inside, see if the lab children's unity truly veiled some hidden malevolence. She left Eric's bunker with little more than a small pack of food, a knife, and an unspoken promise to return. Moving under the cover of twilight, she navigated the deserted highways, avoiding heavily guarded passageways. A battered sign eventually came into view. "Welcome to Region 7's Sanctuary." A chain-link fence stretched as far as she could see, with tall watchtowers shining blue beams out into the darkness. Rolling her shoulders to quell her trembling, she approached the main gate. A lab-child guard looked at her with calm, appraising eyes. He asked for identification, then stared several moments at the battered old ID chip Arik had salvaged from a decade before. He pressed a sequence of buttons, and a gentle hum issued from the thick gate as it rolled open. Entering hesitantly, Elia stepped into a bizarre contrast to the wasteland outside. Here, vibrant hydroponic gardens stretched behind the fence walls. Rows of sleek solar panels glinted under overhead lamps, powering an entire settlement filled with meticulously designed buildings. Before she could start exploring on her own, 2 uniformed lab children came to escort her deeper inside, explaining they were leading her to an orientation center. The orientation center was a glass and steel atrium with polished floors and ascending staircases. People, almost all lab children, moved quietly, systematically. They glanced at Elia with curiosity but no overt hostility. She soon discovered that the new regime was well planned and structured around councils. Energy, agriculture, education, and defense. Each council handled a sector of communal life, and each lab child was assigned to a council according to personal aptitude. The week-long orientation was designed to integrate new arrivals into the system. Elia was struck by how seamlessly integrated everything appeared. There was an undeniable order, yet the place felt disconcertingly devoid of chaos, that messy, unpredictable pulse that she remembered from her childhood among natural-born people. A small part of her recognized the remarkable achievement. Another part felt uneasy, especially when she learned that the councils decided nearly every aspect of life, from daily schedules to family structures. Nova found Elia on the 3rd day. They recognized each other with cautious warmth. Nova explained that she worked in the Education Council, specifically focusing on bridging the gap between lab children and any natural-born arrival. But as they walked together through the neatly compressed streets, Nova admitted that not all lab children saw a future for natural-born individuals. They call them legacies. Some of our people believe the entire legacy of the old world is too tainted to preserve. But I believe differently. She glanced sideways at Elia. We still need you. But there are voices in the councils who push for total separation. Rumors of forced relocation are spreading. The statement confirmed Elia's worst suspicions. The veneer of acceptance was cracking. Whispers of an uprising began to stir among the lab children themselves. Odd as it sounded, not all wanted to stay in this rigid system. Some, lab-born but individually curious, clashed with the councils over the strict control. Meanwhile, certain factions of survivors, outside, threatened to mount a resistance, claiming they would never surrender the old ways. The entire settlement buzzed with tension as the days passed. Elia encountered lab children who moved with desperate fervor, smuggling supplies, forging alliances. She also encountered natural-born refugees who had tried to integrate but found themselves relegated to menial tasks with little upward mobility. The orientation sessions taught newcomers how to navigate the system, but it was painfully clear that having been born of the old world counted against them. The councils kept their pride in the new lineage carefully veiled, but the message was there, simmering beneath bright smiles and gentle guidance. One evening, Elia sat on a bench beside a synthetic pond located near the education facility. Nova met her there. "We need your help," Nova said quietly. "Some lab children are questioning our entire structure. They don't want to align themselves with either the council's stagnation or the radical group that wants to push natural-born humans out entirely. They want a united future, an integrated society, truly free. But to do that, they need allies outside and inside. I believe you're the one who can connect us to the old world survivors." Elia was taken aback, uncertain whether she possessed enough influence, but Nova spoke with unwavering determination. "They know you, and they trust you more than they trust us. You can be the key." Within a few days, plans were in motion for an underground meeting. A small group of lab children who questioned the leadership gave Elia a safe passage out of the sanctuary to seek out her uncle. She traveled cautiously, aware that the roads were heavily patrolled. Every time she passed a silent checkpoint, she waited for sirens. It never happened. Reaching the bunker, she found Arik spooked. He described roving squads of lab child enforcers who were confiscating property, claiming they were consolidating resources for the greater good. Families who refused to comply vanished in the night. Arik initially refused to help. He glowered at the mention of a lab childlet coalition. "We can't trust them, Elia. They were made in test tubes, never nursed at a real mother's breast. Things that come out of a lab can't have hearts." Elia argued back. "We've seen their kindness. They're not just robots. They want to live too, and they want freedom from these councils." It was the most intense argument they'd ever had. Eventually, Arik's resolve softened, or perhaps he saw no other path forward. He agreed to attend a secret gathering at the outskirts of Region 7 Sanctuary. The chosen spot was a derelict factory once used by the labs for early prototypes. Surrounded by twisted metal beams, half-collapsed walls, and a roof missing several plates, it provided cover from prying eyes. On a moonlit night, a ring of flickering lanterns illuminated 24 figures huddled together, about half lab children, half natural-born. Nova stood near the center, addressing the group with a steady voice. She proposed a plan. Sabotage the strict control points from within while forging an alliance with outside survivors to resist the more extremist lab children. She described the Council's latest measures, large-scale expansions, forced relocations, and rumors of a newly developed serum that could potentially sterilize all natural-born humans, ensuring they would be the last generation. The cruelty of it chilled everyone present. A fierce debate ensued, with arguments flying about whether sabotage was the right choice, or whether they should attempt negotiation. Arik stood and delivered a scathing rebuttal. "They're planning genocide. Negotiation is worthless." Yet, a lab child named Harlan, who worked in defense, maintained that not all council members endorsed such plans. He had overheard older scientists from the original labs discussing more peaceful alternatives. Disagreements simmered, with some pushing for an all-out assault and others clinging to a hope for reconciliation. Nova eventually brokered a tentative consensus, a short-term sabotage to prevent the councils from implementing the sterilization plan, followed by an attempt to negotiate. If negotiation failed, only then would they consider more drastic measures. The next day, under disguise, Elia re-entered Region 7 Sanctuary. Harlan smuggled her past the Defense Council's security into the lower levels of the biotech lab. The corridors were silent, sanitized, with overhead lights casting sterile white reflections on the polished floor. Heart-pounding, Elia crept through the facility, guided by Harlan's cryptic instructions. Eventually, she found a sterile storage area where vials of the rumored serum were kept, labeled Project Purity. Each slender cylinder shimmered with a pale blue liquid. Her mind spun as she read the documented effects. Induced infertility in standard Homo sapiens, no effect on Lab A genes. She had no illusions left. This was unequivocally a means to eradicate natural-born reproduction. She scrambled to the control panel that regulated temperature. Her instructions were simple: sabotage the cooling thresholds so the delicate serum would degrade. One by one, she dialed each temperature setting to the highest permissible limit, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Then came footsteps. She froze, heart hammering in her ears. A voice called out, "Who's there?" She ducked behind a metal container, sweat beading on her forehead. The footsteps drew closer. One person, possibly two. After a few agonizing seconds, she heard a muffled conversation about a security glitch. The footsteps receded. She exhaled in relief and darted from the storage room, leaving behind the compromised vials. For now, the serum was neutralized, but it was only a matter of time before the council discovered the sabotage. Harlan instructed Elia to slip out through a utility corridor. "We'll gather at the old factory in 2 days to see if they suspect anything," he whispered. She nodded, feeling herself for the tense hours ahead. For 2 days, the sanctuary buzzed like a stirred beehive. Announcements reminded citizens to report suspicious behavior. A higher guard presence paced the streets. Elia hid in a cramped building on the settlement's outskirts, carefully avoiding any official eyes. Through a small crack in a boarded window, she watched foot patrols move in formation. She recognized the tall figure of a council member, Joseph Sato, who was rumored to stand at the apex of the new regime. He gave crisp orders, urging vigilance and unity. For a moment, Elia's eyes locked with his from across the street. She pressed herself against the wall, hoping he hadn't seen her. A trickle of anxiety dripped down her spine. On the third night, Elia managed to slip away. The meeting at the old factory was large, over 50 people now, an energized mixture of lab children, dissidents, and natural-born survivors. Nova took the floor, explaining that the sabotage had worked. The sterilization serum was ruined. The council might try to produce more, but it would take time and resources. Morale soared, but victory was short-lived. Nova delivered grave news. The council had declared martial law within the sanctuary, citing a serious threat from legacy radicals and traitors. All rumored saboteurs were to be arrested on sight. The next steps were uncertain. Several in attendance clamored for open rebellion, urging the group to overthrow the council before they consolidated even more power. That night, the group decided on a two-pronged approach: publicly demand negotiations with the council under the threat of widespread sabotage. If the councils refused or used stalling tactics to create more serum, the coalition would launch a large-scale uprising from within. Volunteers stepped forward to coordinate infiltration of each council sector. Arik surprised Elia by joining the infiltration group. Perhaps he had finally accepted that the only chance of saving the natural-born was to stand shoulder to shoulder with the lab children who believed in unity. Elia found herself, with Nova and Harlan once again, planning the best way to approach Joseph Sato with demands. She had never expected her life to revolve around politics and insurgency, but here she was, fighting for identity, hers and that of the entire species. The day of negotiations arrived. A large open square in the sanctuary was chosen for the meeting. presumably so the councils could set up vantage points and monitor everything. At midday, citizens and curious onlookers gathered, forming a wide circle around a makeshift platform. With a pounding heart, Elias stood among coalition representatives. On the opposite side, Joseph Sato and several council figures waited, faces unreadable. Nova stepped forward, opened negotiations with a declaration that they sought equality for all humans, lab-born or not. She appealed to reason, to the idea that by forging a single community that allowed for personal freedom, it could ensure the long-term survival of the species. The speech was eloquent, but the crowd remained divided. Sato calmly replied that while the councils held the same lofty goals, the sabotage of the serum was an act of violence. He insisted that Project Purity was merely a contingency to ensure no further pandemics would arise from unregulated human genetics. "We do not desire to eradicate natural-born humans," he said. "We merely want to safeguard future generations from inherited vulnerabilities." It was a lawyerly pivot, and some onlookers nodded. The coalition pressed him. Arik spoke passionately of forced relocations, confiscations, and the secret nature of the serum. Sato's expression flickered for the briefest moment. He offered a measured apology for any overstep, then pivoted again, proposing that the coalition disband and trust the council to be judicious about new measures. Nova stood firm. "We want a written guarantee of inclusion, natural-born and lab-child alike, without forced relocations, confiscations, or further efforts at genetic sterilization of any group." The tension was suffocating. Armed guards edged closer. Sato's council members exchanged glances. Finally, Sato responded, "We will consider it, but we must maintain security in the meantime." That was not the concession the coalition sought. A wave of frustration rippled through the crowd. A single voice yelled, "Lies!" Others demanded specifics. The sense of order threatened to crumble. In the throng, Elia spotted trembling hands around concealed weapons. The next words would determine whether they would walk away peacefully or spark a riot. Suddenly, gunfire erupted. From a nearby rooftop, an unidentified figure opened fire on the platform. Chaos flared. Panicked screams arose. Some lab children dove for cover while others quickly formed defensive lines. Guards returned fire at the rooftop. In the confusion, Sato ducked behind the stage. Coalition members scattered. Nova tried to restore calm, but her voice was lost in the pandemonium. Elia found herself shoved to the ground. A swirl of bodies stampeded in every direction. Smoke canisters discharged, throwing the square into a haze of choking fumes. Disoriented, Elia coughed and stumbled, struggling to find a way out. Outside the swirling smoke, sirens blared. The gathering had devolved into a battlefield. Coalition and council loyalists clashed in smaller skirmishes on the outskirts of the square. Arik managed to grab Elia's arm, dragging her away from the worst of it. Nova and Harlan, though partially blinded by smoke, regrouped with a handful of others behind a cluster of cargo crates. No one knew who shot first or why. The fragile negotiations had collapsed, and with them, the last best hope for peaceful resolution. By the time the council guards advanced to secure the square, the coalition had fled. In the weeks that followed, the conflict spread like wildfire across multiple sanctuaries. Some lab children rallied behind Sato and the councils, seeking to stamp out dissent under a banner of enforced progress. Others joined the uprising, burning the council facilities and hacking the data systems that tracked new births. Natural-born survivors emerged from hiding to fight alongside lab-child dissidents, forging improbable alliances. The impetus was clear. Human identity itself was at stake. Could the new generation and the old lineage coexist? Or was one destined to eradicate the other? Amid the chaos, Elia and Nova traveled to region after region, urging the warring factions to see reason, to remember that lab-grown or natural-born mattered less than preserving empathy and diversity. Some listened. Others only wanted blood. The fight escalated in places, cooled in others. In pockets where the coalition took over, they dismantled the forced sterilization programs and opened the sanctuaries to all. Yet, in other regions, still under council control, the crackdown became ruthless. No one wanted to concede. Death tolls rose on both sides. Some said the entire conflict burned too bright and too fast to last. The struggle went on for months, each side wearing down under the endless strife. Confusion spread as rumors of peace negotiations surfaced in tandem with news of fresh battles. Eventually, the unifying line became blurred. There were lab children on both sides as well as natural-born survivors. The labels synthetic and legacy no longer told the whole story. People were fighting over how humanity should progress, a question that transcended mere genetics. On the newest dawn, Aaliyah found herself standing on a hill, overlooking a battered settlement. She thought about her parents, the plague, the labs, the kindness and cruelty that existed in both natural-born and lab-grown. She reflected on Nova's conviction that identity was more than biology, that perhaps belonging was a choice, a shared moment of recognition in one another's eyes. Spreading below her was a city with walls scorched by recent conflict, whose streets were dotted with improvised barricades. But the morning light glimmered on solar panels, signifying there was still power literal and metaphorical to rebuild. Behind her, Nova approached and stood in silence. They both gazed at the rising sun. Whether a fragile peace would ever settle or a new wave of destruction loomed, neither could say. But in that quiet moment, with fields of broken glass reflecting a sky streaked with color, the future of human identity remained uncertain. Lab-grown or naturally born, everyone who remained would need to decide if the story they forged would tear them apart or, in the ashes of the old world, finally unite them.